Hey guys, Matt here from the Traveling Together Journal, bringing you another update on my camper build.
In previous videos, you've watched me build a custom camper out of steel, wood, pour foam, fiberglass, and epoxy resin. And in the last episode, I installed the doors and painted the exterior. Now we're ready for the rear bumper, and I have just the piece of scrap steel in mind. I roughly put it in place to get an idea of how I wanted to position it. I didn't want it to stick out too far off the back or hang down too low, since the departure angle on these trucks is pretty poor to begin with. I used some 1x2 rectangular steel tubing that I had left over from the subframe to build the bumper mounts. These will bolt onto the frame rails through the 6 stock bumper mounting points. So I drilled out the mounting holes in each of the 1x2s to match. I decided to mount the bumper with a bit of a slant to help the truck's departure angle, so I cut off the back of the mounts at a 45-degree angle. The bumper is made of 1.5 by 6-inch C-channel. I used an angle grinder with a cutting wheel to notch out where the mounts will go, then welded the mounts onto the C-channel, going all the way around the seam. Then I notched out the ends of the C-channel. I originally cut the C-channel 2 inches longer than I wanted the bumper to end up being, so that I could bend the center section of the C-channel around these notched curves on either end. Once I was satisfied with the shape of the notches, I used a large C-clamp to bend the protruding sections of the C-channel and hold it in place while I welded it to the curved notches. To get the final bends, I used a pipe wrench to apply a little leverage and finished welding the inside seams. Then I added a weld to the outside of each of the seams and smoothed it out with an angle grinder. There were a couple of unwanted holes in the C-channel that I closed up with a series of welds, then grinded smooth. Next, I added some holes to mount the tail lights. These aren't the best looking lights, but they were cheap and easier to mount than the sleek recessed tail lights. Next came a big hole right down the center. This is so that I can access the stock underbed spare tire carrier, where I plan to continue stowing my spare tire. I thought it would be cool to dimple dye this thing, but I don't have a dimple dye. I was able to get a similar effect using a press sleeve and my hydraulic press. In theory, this adds a bit of rigidity, but I really just did it for the novelty. Mounting the license plate, I wanted to cover the spare tire access hole, but be able to easily uncover it if needed. I came across these self-closing cabinet hinges that seemed to do the trick with a little modification and some fresh paint. At this point, I used a flapper wheel on the angle grinder to knock off the rust and smooth it out with a palm sander, before applying a coat of Rust-Oleum rusty metal primer and a top coat of Rust-Oleum stop rust enamel. The bumper fit nicely onto the stock mounting points on the truck frame, and the access to the spare tire carrier lined up as planned. I mounted the hinges and license plate and added a little piece of foam rubber to the back of the license plate so it wouldn't rub off the paint. Next, I mounted the taillights, but when I went to wire them up, I realized how wrecked my stock wiring was. I cut off the tattered mess and wired up some 5-point harnesses so I could unplug the lights if I wanted to remove the bumper. Unfortunately, the lights didn't work. I guess that's what I get for not testing cheap electronics from Amazon before installing them. While I was waiting for replacement lights, I started working on my backup camera. I won't be able to see anything out my rearview mirror anymore, so I thought it would be pretty nifty to have one of these little cameras. And a company called Carpuride happened to offer me one at just the right time. It comes with a 9-inch display, a manual, 2 mounting options, a power cable, an audio cable, and a backup camera with its own power and video cable. I wanted to get a feel for how the screen worked before I decided where to mount it, so I took it out to my truck to try it out. It's designed to be easy to install or remove, so it comes with a standard 12-volt cigarette lighter plug that plugs into the side of the screen, and it automatically turns on when given power. I'm not very tech-savvy, but the big touchscreen display makes it easy for me to navigate, and even I was able to figure out how to link my iPhone to the screen. I haven't ever had a screen in a vehicle before, so being able to see directions while I'm driving sounds pretty cutting edge to me. It can also be used to do hands-free calling and link to your car's audio to control music playing off of your phone. Next, I rigged up this contraption with a spare battery to test the backup camera. It worked perfectly. The idea is that you would wire the camera into your vehicle's reverse light circuit so that the camera is given power when you put the vehicle in reverse. and when the camera gets power, it is automatically displayed on the screen. Everything was looking good at this point, but it unfortunately took a turn for the worse when I inspected the mounting options. The dash mount was the one that I was expecting to use, but no matter how tight I clamped down on the joint, it still had an obvious amount of play in it. It would clearly allow the screen to jiggle around too much on any kind of unsmooth driving conditions. The suction cup mount felt surprisingly sturdy, even though it had more adjustability with this ball socket joint and an extending arm. I was feeling pretty optimistic until I attached it to the windshield. The suction cup itself flexed and allowed a lot of movement. So it was up to me to build the better mousetrap. I used a bit of scrap steel and the adjustable arm from the suction cup mount and attached it to the dash with Sikaflex 221 adhesive and a couple of pancake head screws. The result was a much sturdier screen mount. I didn't want to occupy my only 12-volt outlet by having the screen plugged into it all the time, so I pulled apart the Carpuride plug. Inside is a DC to DC converter that takes the 12 to 24 volt power out of your vehicle and turns it into 5-volt power that the screen needs. I broke off the prongs of the input terminals and soldered on a bit of wire, then coated it in liquid electrical tape before shimmying it back into the housing and soldering the new input leads onto the back of my cigarette lighter. I didn't want cables dangling across the front of my dash, so I drilled a hole next to the screen mount and ran the power cable and the backup camera video cable behind the dash. The video cable then runs underneath the scuff plate and exits the cab to meet up with the taillight wiring loom and runs back to the rear bumper where it plugs into the backup camera. The camera came with double-sided tape and a couple of screws. I ditched the factory screws and used machine screws to attach it to the bumper. The double-sided tape conveniently held the camera in place while I tightened down the hardware. I got my new lights mounted and wired into the 5-prong plugs, and this time it looks like they're fully functional. And so is the backup camera and screen. At this point, I decided to take some measurements. One of my goals with this camper build was to stay within the stock vehicle dimensions regarding length and width. From bumper to bumper, the truck now measures 207.1 inches, and the widest point is 75.4 inches wide. Compared to T100 stock dimensions of 209.1 inches long and 75.2 inches wide. So we did pretty well there, but I wanted to wrap the rear bumper around the corners of the camper, so I had to make it a little bit wider. I also wanted to improve the departure angle of the truck since we drug the rear bumper plenty of times on previous trips. I couldn't find the departure angle for a stock T100 listed on the internet anywhere, so I'm measuring off of my T100 with a camper shell on it to get a baseline of 23.37 degrees as the departure angle. Our new departure angle on the project truck is 31.28 degrees. Still nothing to brag about, but a big improvement there. I'm going to put up a spreadsheet on the screen to show how these numbers compared to some other vehicles that I looked up online. Keep in mind that these are stock dimensions, and you often see these vehicles modified to make them longer or wider, and usually improve the departure angle if they're lifted or have larger tires on them. Well, that wraps up the rear bumper project. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time as I get to work on the camper's electrical system.